Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
On today's program, we're going to talk about the turmoil in South Africa and possible economic sanctions against that country. We're going to talk about the so-called new militancy of the National Organization for Women as a result of its recent election. And we're going to talk about the political diversions and missed opportunities for President Reagan's legislative agenda. Panelists for today's Public Affairs Roundtable include Hal Chase from Ball State University's History Department, commenting on U.S. choices in South Africa, Sue Arrington, who directed the Elections Committee of the National Organization for Women, who will talk about NOW's strategy for the future, and John Rouse from Ball State University's Political Science Department, talking about President Reagan's choices before Congress. Hal Chase, what is the situation in South Africa that has the United States talking about economic sanctions and such?
Larry, it's primarily white racism, the lack of democracy. I'd like, first of all, though, I think for our viewers to give them an idea of where South Africa is just geographically, because I think that relates to your question. So if you will, we have a map here that shows you right there where it's located geopolitically. It's right there at the southern tip and closes the southern tip of Africa. And so on the viewer's right, you have Asia, India, that whole region, plus the Persian Gulf from which we get our oil that has to go around the Cape of South Africa there. And then on the left, of course, is the South Atlantic, and that leads into Europe and America and South America. So geopolitically, it's strategically based right in the center, you might say, between Asia and Europe, Euro-America. In the right-hand corner there, you see a map that shows you the size of South Africa comparative to Indiana, for example. You can see it right there. That is South Africa superimposed on a continental map of the U.S. It gives you an idea of its size. So back to your question. The issue there is that 70% roughly the population, about 23 million people who are legally designated as, quotes, black, cannot vote. They do not have any political rights in the Republic of South Africa. I think that's primarily the issue as far as black South Africans are concerned. They, like other people, would like to control their own political destiny. They are the overwhelming majority in that regard. The other issue, I think, is white racism, as I said. The notion that you, first of all, have different races. That some of us are, quotes, white, that some of us are, quotes, black. And some
as defined by law. Is that the
in
way
South Africa, it's
yeah.
defined by law, that's right. And everybody, be you, quotes, white or, quotes, colored or, quotes, black, has to carry a pass, somewhat similar to our own Indiana driver's licenses, where you have a little card that you carry around. I don't have one, South African one, but I have an Indiana one, and there's, you see why it has your picture on it. And so, like in South Africa, if you're a policeman and I am walking along the street and for some reason you'd like to stop me, you see you can ask for my pass. That kind of oppression is all based on the notion of race, that there are categorically different types of people.
What's the comparison? People are comparing the United States to South Africa, that there was slavery in the United States up until 125 years ago. There was separate but equal school systems up until Brown versus Board of Education in '54, the decision, and even desegregation is still with us.
That's right.
Forced busing. How is people are saying, I guess, the United States position of sanctions against South Africa is a really self-righteous stand. Is the United States really doesn't have any stand to take because basically an integrated society in the United States is not all that old an idea. It is a fairly recent phenomenon in the United States. I mean, is there a difference between what we see, I guess, as American racism of our recent past and South African racism?
I'd say no. I'm old enough, Sue's old enough, and John's old enough to remember American apartheid.
But
he grew up in South Carolina.
I mean, yes, in that illustration, I one time saw a white man tell a black man that he couldn't have a drink of water out of a water fountain. As a 15-year-old, that was a very impressionable kind of thing. And even though there was segregation in 1957 when this occurred, that was a strange kind of thing, I thought, for anybody to tell anybody else they couldn't have a drink of water. But we really have to say that the whole legal and history of America is very different from that of South Africa. Do we not? The historical thing between the two states, countries, are of course different, are they not?
John, blacks could vote in South Africa up until the early 20th century, and in some provinces up until 1935.
Blacks could also vote in this country technically as of 1868 or whenever the 15th Amendment was passed.
John, there are blacks voting in the United States in 5 different states before the Civil War. And then, as you know, after the Civil War, it technically became universal in the United States. Larry's question, was there a difference? I understood it to mean, was there a difference in the white racism that produced slavery and what we call segregation in this country, both by law in 17 states and by practice in such states as Indiana? And I say no. One piece of evidence I can think of, Larry, is last weekend, the rally down in southern Indiana for the Ku Klux Klan. What did the man say on television? Heather came in to tell me about it. My oldest daughter, who said, you ought to come see this. So, yes, I did. I missed the segment she told me about, which was, John, the man said, somebody asked him about blacks, and he said, we ought to send them all back to South Africa and bring those white people over here. So I would say there's not a significant difference between that kind of white racism and the kind of white racism that has produced a legally segregated system in South Africa.
Yeah, but the point I would make is that particular opinion is simply the opinion of the person who's a member of the KKK.
Correct.
It is certainly not the policy of this state or this country and hasn't been for 25 years. So certainly there's a difference in terms of the implementation of the concept racism in South Africa and in America.
John, you know yourself that the NAACP at their recent meeting earlier this month condemned William Bradford Reynolds as a nominee for the head of the Justice Department and for his stands about certain cases. The Reagan administration has been severely criticized by black Americans and white Americans for their perceived stands on, quotes, racial fairness. There are people who would argue, too, that we've been backing up as far as the legal aspect of integration is concerned in this country.
Okay, any sort of economic sanctions that the administration might lead or Congress might lead against South Africa, you think that is an appropriate vehicle to try to enact change or force change in South Africa?
Yes, I do, Larry. And I've been encouraged by the positions of Senator Lough from the standpoint that I've never known beforehand that Lough was particularly interested. That is not his constituency. But he now, I think, has different aspirations and has realized as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that he needs to take a stand on this, and so he has people pushing him to, as reported yesterday or the day before, to come forth with some sanctions against South Africa, as the French have done and some other nations have done. French, by the way, surprised me because they've been the major arms seller to South Africa. The South African Air Force is largely Mirage jets. So that to me was very significant. Of course, it means that France's economic interests in West Africa and Central Africa, I think, are coming into play. So I think it's more a political situation than a matter of self-righteous principle or morality.
Hal, if I could pick up on a question, why should we in this state, in Indiana, where we have a black population of about 7.5%, but why are Americans, and in a more particular way, why are Hoosiers, why should we be interested in the future of South Africa?
I think primarily, John, first of all, fundamentally, I think it is a moral issue. I mean, we're 4 human beings, we're sitting here, we're discussing a topic that affects people's lives. If somebody in South Africa were talking about your situation, where you, as a majority, had no political rights, you didn't have property rights, John. There were legal statutes that said you could go here, you could go there, you had to live X, you had to live Y. I think you would feel, as well as think, that that was not right. So I think there's a moral dimension here, just as we would sit here and agree that if we were enslaved, that would not be right. And anybody who was not enslaved should be speaking out as well against that unfair system, wrong system.
But why, excuse me, sir.
Do you think that the worldwide attention that's focused on South Africa is going to, in the next few years, affect a change in the way blacks are treated there?
I think that the way South Africa will go is the way that black South Africans will take it. That's what I think. Outside influence, to me, is responding to what blacks are doing in South Africa.
But don't you think that the attention that it's getting encourages them in their fight for equality?
That's a good question I can't answer. I do not know. I really don't know what black South Africans are seeing. They do have television in that nation. They do have a press. They do have 1 million people living in very close proximity to Johannesburg, so I'm assuming that you can walk by a stand and pick up a newspaper, whether you be in Johannesburg or down in Port Elizabeth where there's lots of turmoil. So I would say they must be aware. Now, but I don't know that they're seeing Desmond Tutu, Bishop Tutu, on television the way Americans are. I don't.
But I think they must have a grapevine system. If they don't get it through television or their newspapers, I would guess that the word is out. And if I were there and a black South African, that would help me keep my spirits up and think, there are a lot of other people that are encouraging us on.
What would you feel? In other words, the worldwide press is positive. It is supporting your demonstrations, etc. But what do you do if they come into the room and, as they would in South Africa, and literally pick you up and take you away under the emergency decree, which has been in effect now almost 10 days, Sunday last. And they just pick you up, and they don't have to tell your husband, Paul, where you are. They don't have to tell anybody. You're just gone. And there are reportedly 1,800 people now who've been detained. What I think is most interesting that they're not telling me is how selective that is. In other words, with this pass system, Larry, with everybody with a book, they know exactly who you are. If they want to, as it were, if they think that Larry Lough is subversive or controversial in a way they don't want on the Muncie Star, they come in and they get him. Or Sue Arrington's doing the same thing and rousing women, like this woman, Sheena Duncan, who's been in the United States, Black Sash. Well, I want to know, was she at Now? Did she have connection to Now? And what about Molly Blackburn? What does Now say? We get these people coming to the United States, but people, and particularly black South Africans there, are being detained. Blackburn was detained herself, and she's, quotes, white. So I think that the media is one thing, and you can say, yes, it does help your morale, Sue. But if you're detained and you're like Nelson, this happened before 1960. First of all, 1960, the government said emergency after Sharpsville, which some of you probably remember, this incident where they literally shot 59 people. Cold blood, bang, dead. They were burning their pass cards. Emergency decree. And then in the months that followed, Nelson Mandela went underground because he was one of the organizers of the Sharpsville demonstrations. So they did this before. Nelson Mandela spent the last 24 years in Robben Island.
But it seems, this kind of thing that you describe is very graphic. And of course, freedom and democracy are very fragile things. But the issue is, why are we concerned about South Africa and not concerned about the same kinds of things that are occurring all throughout Africa in terms of black-on-black racism, in terms of dictatorships throughout Africa, most recently in Uganda. The same kinds of things occur in the Soviet Union in terms of the people there. Why are we concerned about South Africa and not concerned about the peoples of the Soviet Union and the other peoples in Africa?
I think the answer is, as Larry raised it initially, I think the answer is white racism, John. You still have a system, generally speaking, around the world. You know it is called the North-South dialogue, where, quotes, whites are dominating, quotes, colors. And we have that perception by a lot of people in the so-called colored world, the so-called third world. And you have that, John, and so they're concerned about it from the standpoint of South Africa has become a symbol. How's it going to go, John? Are we going to have revolution in the sense of race war? If we have race war, John, people will become very clear as to what it means to Indiana. We're a minority, quotes, we whites are a minority in this world. And that truth could come home and hit hard. And then you start to try and justify, well, if whites are a minority, why is their system in power? Sue and I were talking earlier. Men are a minority in this country. That's why Hal Chase walks around and supports ERA ratification.
Well, let's move the discussion of equality to the states, and let's talk about the National Organization for Women, the nation's lobby for women, if you will. Is that a fair generalization, Sue?
I think so.
Okay.
Yes.
An election. Eleanor Smeal comes back into power. Does this mean, one, that the National Organization for Women is having a change of direction, and does it mean that direction, if it is changing, is a more militant one, that changes aren't coming fast enough and you want to see some action?
Okay, first of all, in terms of issues, there really was no difference between the two candidates, so I don't expect that we will see any difference in the issues that now addresses. In fact, there's only one issue currently that I can think of that there is internal discussion and disagreement on within the whole feminist movement, and that's on the issue of how to deal with pornography. Maybe later in the program you want to say talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of this election, the issue that the now delegates had to vote on was what kind of tactics and strategy we wanted to use to promote issues of women's equality. Judy Goldsmith has been very good at the behind-the-scenes type of lobbying and work on women's issues. There's no doubt about it. She was very instrumental in getting attention focused on a woman for vice president, for example. However, Ellie Smeal, I think, reflects more of now's characteristic type of strategy, which is not to forget the behind the scenes altogether, because they go together, but to put greater emphasis than what we have had in the last 2 years on a high profile, the kinds of things that get public attention. Things like marches, demonstrations, those kinds of things.
But Sue, we walked around Washington July 78, right? Our little white clothes and so forth. They had maybe 100,000 to 150,000 people, they reported. Did it get it ratified?
No, it didn't. But it kept the issue before the public, and I believe that it rallied public support. Now, where our problem is, it's the public that wasn't voting for the Equal Rights Amendment. It was the state legislatures, the majority of whom, of the legislators, are men. And when you analyze the votes of the male legislators and the women legislators on the Equal Rights Amendment, the women overwhelmingly voted for it. And if women were representative in places of power, like legislatures and Congress, to the same degree that we are in the population, we would have the Equal Rights Amendment today.
Is ERA an issue any longer?
Yes. People now still, even in these last 2 years, if we put out a membership drive or just a solicitation letter, the one that gets the best return is still the Equal Rights Amendment. The one that rivals it is on abortion.
So let me ask this question. What's a feminist?
Well, I'm a feminist.
Okay.
I think a feminist is sort of hard for people to get a handle on, because it's a label that from the early days of the feminist movement has been defined not only by people who are feminists, but by those who aren't. I look at, for example, women who say, well, I'm not a feminist, but I believe that women should have equal pay for equal work. I believe that women should have equal educational opportunities as men. And the list goes on and on. Now, even though this woman does not believe that she's a feminist, I think she is. Maybe really what a feminist is someone who believes those things and admits that, yes, this is what feminism is.
Well, the problem I have is that I'm almost sure once someone watches this program, they're going to ask me, why did you have that liberal feminist on that program? And what should I tell them?
Well, I guess, they just have to judge for themselves.
John, I have an answer to that, all right? I'll tell them. And that is, we're talking about the rights of American citizens, just as we were in South Africa. And what we're talking about is human development. You ask me what a feminist is, and I would say it's a woman, meaning physical gender, who wants to realize more potential. Basically, that has been circumscribed by traditional roles of what a woman ought to do. I think men have been circumscribed as well. I'm supposed to not cry, etc., right, John? You remember that. We don't cry. We're supposed to be tough. We don't kiss our children, kind of thing. We don't show affection, and so forth and so on. And I think that's limiting. I think you'd agree. I don't want to be limited that way. I may have lots of potential that has been circumscribed by social roles. I think that's what a feminist is. So we don't want this role. Don't put me in a pigeonhole, some stereotype of what a woman ought to be or do. And I'm saying that affects men. It seems to me, quotes, black and white, racism is similar to, quotes, sexism. And you don't want to be put in a pigeonhole. And we know biologically that increasingly clear that we have both.
Okay, but let me ask Sue again. Sue, why do you think that society fights so much of what Hal is talking about?
Well, we have centuries of looking at men and women in certain ways. And people who have been in power over the centuries have largely been men. The institutions of this country and every country have been formed by men. And when you're talking about this kind of tradition, it does take a long time to overcome it. When you look at the suffragist movement, which was the first recognized women's movement in this country, their issues were the same ones that we speak out on today. As the years went by, they narrowed their energy on working to get the right to vote. But if you look at what they did, it was on a whole range of issues. It's going to take a while.
John Rouse, in a couple of minutes we have left here, obviously women's rights is not at the top of President Reagan's agenda. There are some things he has up there. They might involve foreign relations, they might involve the budget, they might involve issues of the religious right, but he has a problem now, perhaps, in pursuing his agenda. What about that?
Yeah, historically, especially in this century, the executive has not been very effective. We can point to perhaps 4 times. 1912, 1914, New Federalism, Woodrow Wilson. 1933, 1937, Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal. 1964, 1965, LBJ, health, Medicare is 20 years old this week, education and civil rights. All three examples are examples of government doing more. In 1981, Ronald Reagan, I think, constitutes the fourth effective executive in terms of policy, but it was not using government. So as we look at what is happening right now, this week in Congress, it is the fact that the Congress, Republicans and Democrats, the executive, don't have their act together. They will probably not get their act together on either tax reform or tax cuts.
Is President Reagan's leadership an issue in their inability to compromise?
I don't think it's necessarily an issue. It's just that this country was set up for executives not to be very strong. We spent a whole history trying to overthrow the king, and we don't want very powerful institutions. So it's set up that way.
And the president's recent illness problems, does that affect him as a leader?
I really don't know how ill he is. It depends how ill he is. He is certainly a charismatic person in the sense that he responds from events and things in ways that a 74-year-old man ordinarily would not respond. Most are on the golf course. He's in there pitching.
Okay, we're out of time here today. I'd like to thank the panelists here, Hal Chase, Sue Arrington, John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producer is Mike Seaborn. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.